The sun was a hammer, and the land was the anvil. For weeks, Jedediah Stone had ridden under its relentless swing, feeling the world beaten flat and scorched into a uniform shade of ochre. The earth beneath his horse's hooves was a web of cracks, a map of thirst so profound it seemed the planet itself was dying. The horizon shimmered, a watery lie that promised nothing but more heat, more dust, more of the vast, crushing emptiness that had been his only companion for more years than he cared to count. Silence was the language of this country. It was broken only by the dry whisper of a wind that carried no relief, the rhythmic plod of his gelding, Jericho, and the steady creak of saddle leather. These were the only sounds Jedediah trusted anymore. They were honest sounds. Speaking of effort and endurance, they asked for nothing and offered no false comfort. He was a man carved from the same hard material as the landscape. His movements were spare, his face a mask of sun-cured leather from which a pair of sharp, gray eyes perpetually scanned the terrain. There was no wasted motion in the way he sat his horse, no idle flicker in his gaze. Solitude had pared him down to his essential parts, a rider, a worker, a survivor. Everything else had been burned away long ago. His purpose was as singular and tangible as a stone held in the palm. He was riding to the Vance Ranch to collect a debt, $200 gold. The sum had become a prayer in his mind, a fixed point in a world that had long ago spun loose from its moorings. It was the payment for a 3-month cattle drive that had taken him through hellish storms and across hostile territory, a drive he had undertaken for a man he had never met, Thomas Vance, on the strength of a contract signed by a proxy in a dusty Texas town, $200. It was not just money. It was the price of a small, forgotten piece of land he had scouted in the high territories of Montana, a place walled in by mountains and silence, where a man might finally build a wall high enough to keep the ghosts out. It was the physical weight of a new start. The plodding of the horse, the endless heat, the featureless land, it was a combination that wore down the mind's defenses. As the sun reached its apex, bleaching all color from the sky, the memories came. They never announced themselves, but slipped in through the cracks of his resolve, like smoke under a door. It began not as a thought, but as a smell, the sharp, clean scent of pine, quickly swallowed by the thick, greasy odor of smoke. Then came the image, a vision that tore through the bright day with the violence of a nightmare. Roaring flames licking at a black, starless sky, the skeletal frame of a small cabin, its timbers glowing like the ribs of some great beast. And then the sound, a woman's scream, sharp and terrible, a sound that was ripped from the air before it could be finished. The name was a cinder in his own throat, a word he could no longer speak aloud but which was branded onto his soul. Sarah. He blinked, and the sun-blasted prairie returned. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached, his knuckles white where he gripped the reins. He had lost everything that mattered once, consumed in a night of fire and hate. He had learned the bitter lesson that love, family, hope, they were all flammable. They could be turned to ash in a heartbeat. Since that night, he had sworn himself to a life built on things that could be held, weighed, and counted. He trusted his skill with a rope, the heft of his pistol, the endurance of his horse. And he trusted gold. Gold did not burn. Gold did not scream in the night. Gold could not be taken from him in the same way, because he would never love it enough for its loss to break him. Late in the afternoon, when the shadows began to stretch like weary travelers, he saw it. A dark line on the horizon that slowly resolved itself into a cottonwood tree. Then the low shape of a cabin and a barn, the Vance Ranch, a knot of anticipation, cold and hard, formed in his gut. The end of the trail, the payment. His arrival was not a relief, but a slow-sinking disappointment that curdled into a familiar, bitter anger. The place was a portrait of surrender. The fence posts leaned at weary angles, the wire between them sagging, patched in a dozen places with frayed rope and strips of leather. The barn, a large structure that might once have been impressive, now listed to one side. its great double door hanging from a single, groaning hinge of rusted iron. The fields on either side of the track were choked with thistle and burdock, a testament to months, or perhaps years, of neglect. The only spot of green defiance was a small vegetable garden near the house, a patch of order in a sea of decay. The very air seemed heavy, weighted with the dust of failure. This was not the prosperous homestead he had been led to believe he was working for. Thomas Vance's contract had spoken of 1,000 head of cattle, of lush pastures and a strong operation. This place looked like it was one dry wind away from being swallowed back into the prairie. He felt the hot flush of anger that came with being cheated, a fool's anger. He had risked his life for 3 months on the word of a man who, it seemed, was living on a foundation of lies. He dismounted, the stiffness in his bones a reminder of the long ride. His boots made soft, dusty sounds as he walked towards the house. It was then that he saw her, a lone figure on her knees in the defiant garden. Her back was to him, her head covered by a faded sunbonnet. She wore a simple dress of worn blue calico, patched at the elbows and the hem, and her hands, as she worked the soil around a row of beans, were caked with the dark, rich dirt. He stopped a dozen paces away, the jingle of his spurs loud in the quiet air. She froze, then slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. She turned to face him, pulling the bonnet from her head. Jed had expected to see fragility, perhaps the soft, defeated look of a woman overwhelmed. He did not. Her face was smudged with dirt and etched with lines of weariness that went far beyond a single day's labor. But her posture was straight, and in her eyes, a clear, startling blue. There was a light that was not defiant, exactly, but unbroken. She held his gaze, and the initial flicker of fear he saw at the sight of a tall, armed stranger was quickly shuttered behind a wall of guarded pride. Jedediah Stone was a man who had forgotten the language of pleasantries. He had no time for them. He removed his hat, a gesture of ingrained habit rather than genuine politeness, and held it by his side. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rasp unused to conversation. "I am looking for Thomas Vance." She watched him for a long moment, her eyes taking in his dusty clothes, the trail-worn exhaustion on his face, the Colt revolver holstered low on his hip. "Who is asking for him?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "My name is Jedediah Stone. He owes me a wage." He got straight to the point, seeing no reason to circle it. $200 for the cattle drive I brought in from Texas last spring. The impact of his words was as plain and devastating as a physical blow. The woman's carefully constructed composure did not so much crack as dissolve. The light in her eyes flickered and dimmed, her shoulders slumped, and the strength seemed to drain out of her, leaving behind only a raw and visible grief. Her gaze fell from his face to the parched earth at her feet. "Thomas is dead," she said, the words barely a whisper. She swallowed hard, then looked up again, a new, harder expression settling on her face, the look of someone who had repeated a painful story too many times. "My name is Elara Vance. I am his widow." Jed felt nothing, not surprise, not pity. He felt only the cold, hard reality of a complication. A dead man could not pay his debts. He remained silent, his face unreadable, waiting. He had learned that if you waited long enough, people would fill the silence, often with the truth. Elara's chin lifted a fraction. "He died nearly 2 months ago," she said, her voice now flat, stripped of all emotion as she recited the official version of events. "He took the herd to Clayton to sell. The herd you delivered. He got a good price for them. Or so I was told." She paused, her eyes distant. "He never made it home. They found him the next day at the bottom of Miller's Ravine. His horse had thrown him. The town doctor said he had been drinking heavily. The sheriff ruled it an accident." She finally met his gaze, her blue eyes reflecting a world of pain. "The money from the sale, the gold you are owed, it was never found. The sheriff said it was likely lost in the fall, scattered in the ravine. Or," she added, a bitter twist to her lips, "that he squandered it all in the saloon before he even started for home. That is the story everyone in town believes." Jed's gaze swept over the dilapidated ranch again, and this time he saw it not just as a place of failure, but as a place of ruin. Her story, as thin as it was, fit the evidence. A man drinks away his profits, falls from his horse, and leaves his widow to be consumed by his debts and his shame. It was a common enough tale in the West. As if she could read the cold calculation in his eyes. Ilara continued, her voice gaining a desperate edge. She began to paint a picture for him, a vivid and cruel portrait of her life in the 2 months since her husband's death. Thomas's shameful end, as the town preacher called it from his pulpit, had made her a pariah. The good people of the town, whose fortunes were built on the same kind of risk and hardship, now treated her with a pious mixture of pity and contempt. Neighbors who had once shared coffee at her table now crossed the dusty street to avoid speaking to her. Old friends looked through her as if she were a ghost. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the general store, who had known her since she was a girl, had refused her credit for flour and salt just last week. And then there was Silas Croft. Her voice tightened when she spoke his name. Croft was the most powerful landowner in the county, his vast holdings bordering her own small ranch on 3 sides. He had been circling ever since the funeral, a vulture dressed in a fine suit. He would ride over every week or so, his face a mask of sorrowful concern, and speak of her great burden. He would talk about the difficulty of a woman running a ranch alone, cloaking his greed in the language of neighborly charity, and each time he would make an offer to buy her out, an offer that was a fraction of what the land and its water rights were truly worth. He knew she was alone, trapped by disgrace and sinking into debt. He was just waiting for her to break. Jed listened, his expression unchanged, but inside him a slow, cold war was being waged. He was a pragmatic man. His entire existence for the past 10 years had been governed by a simple, brutal code. A job done is a debt owed. Payment was not a request, it was a right. His first, sharpest instinct was to enforce that right. His eyes, honed by years of assessing livestock and land, made a swift and merciless inventory of her meager assets, the sway-backed milk cow standing in the shade of the dying cottonwood, the half-dozen scrawny chickens scratching in the dust near the porch, the cabin itself, small but sound, and the land. The land was poor, but there were 160 acres of it, and as she had mentioned, it had water rights, legally. The debt was his to collect. He could take it all. He could seize the cow, the chickens, the very deed to the land, sell it all off to Silas Croft or anyone else, and recoup most of his $200. He could leave her with absolutely nothing but the worn dress on her back and ride away. It would be his right. It would be business. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the tremble in her hand as she brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. He saw the sheer grit in the hard set of her jaw. And he saw again that fierce, unbroken will that burned in her eyes. It struck a chord deep within him, an old, painful note he had not heard in a decade. It reminded him of another woman, of a fire, of a scream cut short. The cold logic of survival began to war with an unfamiliar stirring of something he could not name. Empathy, perhaps, or memory. Ilara saw the look in his eyes. She had seen it before in the eyes of the banker, the store owner, and Silas Croft. It was the look of a man weighing her life on a scale. She visibly steeled herself, her spine straightening as if she were preparing for a final, desperate stand. "I do not have your gold, Mr. Stone," she said, her voice clear and without a trace of self-pity. "That is the truth, but I am not without assets." She gestured not to the cow or the house, but to the parched, weed-choked fields around them. "I have this land. It is all I have left of my husband, of the life we tried to build, and I have these." She held up her hands. They were not the soft hands of a townswoman. They were red and calloused, the nails broken, the palms stained with earth. "I will work until I drop to make this land pay. All I am asking for is time, any amount of time you can give me." Her plea, so devoid of tears or weakness, shifted something in him. It was the sheer, stubborn pride of it that broke through his defenses. He saw a woman standing on the edge of utter ruin and refusing to fall. The cold, practical man in him screamed to take what was his and ride on. That was the smart play. That was the safe play. But another voice, one he had thought long dead, spoke instead. In a move that felt foreign and impulsive, a betrayal of the very code that had kept him alive, he made a counteroffer. The words came out of him before he had a chance to weigh them. "I will not take your ranch," he said, the words sounding strange in the quiet air. Elara stared at him, her eyes wide with a confusion that was quickly turning to suspicion. He pressed on, inventing the logic as he went, building a lie to shield himself from the unnerving truth of his motive. "A dead ranch is worth nothing to me. Your neighbor Croft would buy it for pennies. I would not get my due." He looked from her face to the dilapidated barn, then to the fallow fields. "I will stay. I will work alongside you. We will fix the fences, plow the fields, and get a crop in the ground. We will bring this place back." He paused, letting the weight of his offer settle. "I will defer my payment. When we sell the crop, when this ranch makes a profit, I will take my $200, plus my keep for the time I am here. It is a business proposition. Mrs. Vance, a way for me to protect my investment." Elara was stunned into silence. Her world was a simple, brutal place. Men did not offer such deals. Men preyed on weakness. She studied his face, that hard, unreadable mask of stoicism, searching for the trick, the hidden, predatory angle. She saw nothing but a steady, gray-eyed gaze. Was he a fool, or was he something far more dangerous? A man who played a longer, crueler game than even Silas Croft. But her situation was hopeless. She had no other cards to play. Her choice was between the certain, slow ruin offered by Croft and the dubious, inexplicable charity of this stranger. It was no choice at all. With a heavy heart, filled with a caution that felt like a lead weight, she gave a single, sharp nod. "I accept your terms, Mr. Stone." The words sealed their pact, establishing the fragile, tense foundation of their partnership. The sun, finally giving up its fight, bled a deep, wounded red across the western horizon. It cast long, lonely shadows that seemed to stretch from the leaning fence posts and swallow the dilapidated ranch whole. Without another word, Jed turned and walked back to his horse. Elara watched him, a silent statue in her struggling garden. He moved with an easy, economical grace, unsaddling Jericho, the squeak and groan of the leather loud in the evening stillness. He swung the heavy saddle onto his shoulder and led the horse toward the dark, ramshackle barn. From the small porch of the cabin, Elara Vance stood and watched the stranger disappear into the gloom. A tempest of emotions, fear, profound distrust, and a small, terrifying flicker of something that might have been hope raged within her. They were two strangers, bound together by a dead man's debt and the ghosts of their own tragedies, standing together on the very edge of nothing. The day was done, but their struggle had just begun. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, not of the heart, but of the swinging axe and the straining muscle. Life on the Vance ranch became a silent, grinding war waged against a decade of neglect. The sun was their warden, rising early to sentence them to hard labor and setting late, offering a brief parole of exhaustion. The land was their adversary, stubborn and unyielding, giving up every inch with a fight. Their first campaign was against the fences, miles of them. They began each day at dawn, Jedediah driving new posts into the unforgiving ground with a heavy sledgehammer, the rhythmic thud echoing in the vast stillness. Elara followed behind, her smaller frame belying a surprising strength as she wrestled with the heavy spools of barbed wire, stretching it taut until it hummed with tension. Her hands, already calloused from her garden, became a tapestry of new cuts and scrapes. She never spoke of them. Jedediah's own hands, long accustomed to rough work, took on the dark, ingrained dirt of the soil. He wore his leather gloves until the seams split, then worked with bare hands, his palms growing as tough as old boot leather. They moved in a cloud of dust and sweat, their bodies aching in a unison that needed no words. When the last fence post was driven, they turned their attention to a 10-acre field that lay fallow and choked with stone. It was a graveyard of granite, the rocks buried in the soil like ancient teeth. For weeks, this field was their world. The only sounds were the sharp, percussive clang of Jedediah's pickaxe striking stone, a sound that seemed to chip away at the oppressive silence, and the soft, rhythmic thud of Alara hauling the unearthed rocks to the edge of the field, one by one. She built a long, low wall with them, a monument to their shared toil. She would watch him as he worked, the muscles in his back and shoulders coiling and releasing with a power that was both efficient and hypnotic. He swung the heavy tool not with anger, but with a relentless, focused determination, as if each rock he broke was a personal enemy he had sworn to conquer. He, in turn, observed her. He saw the way she pushed on long after her arms trembled with fatigue, her face set in a mask of grim resolve. He noticed she never took the smaller stones first, but always went for the heaviest ones she could manage, as if to prove something to the land, or perhaps to herself. She rose before he did, the smell of coffee and frying bacon already in the air when he emerged from the barn where he had made his bed in an empty stall. She worked until the last light failed, moving about the small cabin in the evenings with a weariness that settled deep in her bones but never seemed to touch her spirit. Her small frame, he came to realize, was merely a shell for a will made of pure iron. Their most frustrating battle was with the water pump. It was the ranch's heart, and it was failing. The handle squeaked and groaned, and for every 10 pumps, it brought up only a trickle of muddy water. Taking it apart was a greasy, infuriating task. Rusted bolts refused to turn, and parts that should have slipped apart were fused together by years of corrosion. It was here, in the close quarters of the well house, that their partnership was truly forged. They had to work together, their bodies often brushing against each other as they strained to turn a stubborn wrench or lift a heavy cylinder. "Hold this steady," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "It is slipping," she would reply, her own voice strained. "Brace it with your foot, there." This was their dialogue, a language of leverage and force, of shared frustration and eventual, hard-won triumph when a rusted nut would finally break free with a sharp crack. They spoke through their labor, and in that shared hardship, a foundation of mutual respect was slowly, silently being laid. In the vast stretches of silence that defined their days, they were in constant communication, learning the measure of each other. Alara saw his profound competence in everything he did. It was in the way he could gentle Jericho with a soft word and a steady hand, in the precise, certain way he sharpened the blade of an axe until it could shave a hair from his arm. She saw it in the way he could read the clouds, forecasting a coming rainstorm with an accuracy that felt like ancient knowledge. But she also began to see something else. In the quiet moments, when the day's work was done and he sat on the porch steps staring out at the darkening plains, a deep, unguarded sorrow would settle in his eyes. It was a look of such profound loss that it made her own grief feel small and new. It was a fleeting glimpse of the man behind the wall, a man who was not just hard, but haunted. Their fragile, two-person world was shattered one blistering afternoon by the arrival of 3 riders. Alara saw them first, a cloud of dust on the horizon that slowly resolved into the shapes of men on horseback. Her stomach tightened. She recognized the confident, almost regal posture of the man in the lead, Silas Croft. He rode a magnificent black stallion that was as well-fed and arrogant as its owner. The 2 men who flanked him were thick-shouldered and hard-eyed, their hands resting casually on the pistols at their hips. Croft reined in his horse a few yards from where Jedediah was repairing the harness for their plow. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his polished boots a stark insult to the dusty ground. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice smooth and deep as he swept off his fine felt hat. "I was just riding the line and thought I would check in on you. It is good to see you are managing." His eyes swept over the newly mended fences and the cleared field, a flicker of something that was not approval in their depths. "We are managing, Mr. Croft, Ilara said, her voice cool. She stood her ground near the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Croft's gaze then settled on Jedediah, who had not stopped his work but had gone very, very still. His eyes narrowed with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "And you have hired some help, I see. I did not realize you had the means for that." Jedediah slowly straightened up. Turning to face the man, he did not speak. He simply stood there, his quiet composure more solid and imposing than the armed men behind Croft. "I am Silas Croft," the landowner said, his tone dripping with condescension. He looked Jedediah up and down, taking in his worn clothes and the trail-worn look of him. "It is a delicate situation. A stranger taking up residence with a widow. People in town have begun to talk. They worry you might be taking advantage of a woman in her time of grief." The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt like another form of heat. Jedediah's hand, which had been holding a piece of leather, dropped to his side, where it came to rest a few inches from the worn grip of his pistol. His eyes, cold and gray as river stones, met Croft's. "I am working off a debt," Jedediah said, his voice a low, even rumble that carried no hint of fear or apology. The simple, direct statement seemed to throw Croft off balance. He had clearly expected a different kind of man, a drifter who would be easily intimidated. He searched Jedediah's face for a crack, for some sign of weakness he could exploit, and found nothing. He saw only a dangerous stillness, an absolute lack of fear that was more unnerving than any open threat. Croft forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Well, as long as everything is proper." He turned his attention back to Ilara. "Remember my offer, my dear. When this fellow has collected his debt and moved on, and you find yourself alone again, my offer to relieve you of this burden still stands. For your own good. Of course." He put his hat back on, a gesture of finality. As he swung himself back onto his horse, he paused and looked back, his eyes glittering. "You would be wise to mind your water rights. My cattle have a tendency to wander when they get thirsty. It is a big country. Things get disputed." With that veiled threat hanging in the air, he and his men wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in their wake. That evening, the tension from Croft's visit lingered in the small cabin like trapped smoke. The oppressive silence that had been their companion for weeks now felt different. It was no longer the silence of two strangers finding their way, but the charged silence of two people who had just faced a common enemy. As Ilara placed a simple meal of beans and cornbread on the rough wooden table, she knew she could not let the silence stand any longer. She watched him eat for a moment. He ate the same way he did everything else, with a quiet efficiency, his eyes focused on his plate. Finally, spurred by the raw reality of the day's threat, she asked the question that had been haunting her since the day he arrived. "Why did you really stay, Mr. Stone?" He did not look up. He finished chewing a mouthful of cornbread before he answered, his voice the same guarded monotone as always. "I told you, to get what I am owed." "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. "There is more to it than that. I see the way you look at this land. I see the way you work. This is not just about $200. A man like you could earn that on any drive, in any town. Why here? Why for me?" He set his fork down and finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. For a long time, he said nothing, and she thought he would retreat back behind his wall. But then, after a pause that seemed to stretch for an eternity, something shifted in his expression. A tiny fissure appeared in the hardened facade. "My father lost his farm to a man just like Croft," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A man with a fat horse and a smiling face who talked about neighborliness while he stole the water and bled my father dry with lawyers. He broke my father's spirit before he broke his bank. I watched it happen." It was the first piece of his personal history he had ever offered her, a small, sharp shard of his past. For Ilara, this revelation was monumental. It was as if he had handed her a key to a room she had not even known existed. In that moment, he was recast. He was no longer just a creditor, an armed stranger whose motives she could not trust. He was an ally. He was a man who understood the particular bitter sting of the injustice she faced because he had seen it before. He had a reason to hate Silas Croft that had nothing to do with her. A few days later, they were back at the fences, repairing a section near the creek that had been trampled, likely by Croft's wandering cattle. Ilara was wrestling with a tangled roll of old barbed wire, trying to salvage a usable length. The rusted metal was stubborn. She pulled harder, her foot slipping in the mud near the bank. The wire sprang back, and a sharp barb sliced across the palm of her hand. The cut was deep, and dark red blood welled up instantly, a shocking contrast to her dirt-streaked skin. A sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips. Before she could even cry out, Jedediah was at her side. He moved with a swift, silent urgency that startled her. "Let me see," he commanded, his voice low. He took her injured hand. His touch, for a man whose entire life was a study in roughness, was startlingly gentle. His large, calloused fingers cradled her smaller hand with an unexpected delicacy, his thumb brushing away the dirt and blood so he could see the wound. Without another word, he pulled a small metal flask from a pouch on his belt. Uncorking it, he poured a stream of whiskey over the cut. The liquid stung like fire, and she flinched, but she did not pull away. He then tore a clean strip from the bottom of his own worn shirt, the sound of the ripping fabric loud in the quiet afternoon. He wrapped the makeshift bandage around her palm, his movements precise and sure. As he tied the knot, his head was bent low over his task, and their eyes locked. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them. The air hummed with a sudden, powerful awareness of each other, not as partners in labor, but as a man and a woman. She could feel the warmth of his breath, see the flecks of gray and blue in his intense eyes. The moment was fleeting, lasting no more than a few heartbeats. He finished the knot, gave her hand a final, brief squeeze, and released her. "Be more careful," he said, his voice gruff, as if to cover the unsteadiness of the moment. He gave a curt nod and turned back to his own work, leaving her standing there, the sharp smell of whiskey on her skin and the memory of his touch burning in her palm. A week later, while clearing years of accumulated junk from the dark, cobweb-choked corners of the barn, Jedediah's foot hit something solid under a pile of old burlap sacks. He kicked them aside and uncovered an old, dust-covered ledger. He picked it up, blowing a cloud of dust from its leather cover. It was Thomas Vance's. He sat on an overturned bucket and began to flip through the pages. Most of it was what he expected: routine notes of expenses, the price of feed, the cost of a new plow blade, dates of calving. But in the back, on the last few pages, the handwriting changed. It was no longer the steady, methodical script of a rancher keeping his books, but a hurried, anxious scrawl. There were a series of notes, short and cryptic. Meeting with Croft again. He wants the South Canyon Spring, says it is his by rights. Another entry a week later, offered to buy the spring outright. The price is good, too good. Deal feels like poison. And a final, chilling entry, dated just 2 days before Thomas's death. Croft is done talking. He will be at the canyon tomorrow. Says we will settle it for good. Jedediah closed the book slowly. It was not proof of anything, not a confession, not a witness, but it was a dark seed of suspicion planted in the fertile ground of his own distrust. Thomas Vance's drunken fall was beginning to feel less like a tragic accident and more like a convenient resolution for Silas Croft. One night, long after the moon had risen, a noise from the barn jolted Ilara from a light, restless sleep. It was a choked cry, a sound of such raw anguish that it raised the hair on her arms. Grabbing the lantern from the mantel, her hands trembling as she lit the wick, she slipped out of the cabin and hurried across the yard. Inside the barn, the lantern light cast huge, dancing shadows. She found Jedediah on his simple bed of hay and blankets in the corner stall. He was thrashing in his sleep, caught in the grip of a violent nightmare, his body tangled in his blanket. "No, Sarah," he muttered, his voice thick with a pain so profound it seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. He was reliving the fire. She could almost feel the heat of it, see the terrible orange glow reflected in his tormented, sleeping face. Hesitantly, she reached out. Her first instinct was to let him be, to retreat and leave him to his private hell. But the sound of his voice, crying out that name, was too full of suffering to ignore. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Stone," she said softly, "Jedediah, wake up." He jolted awake with a guttural cry, his body lurching into a sitting position. His eyes were wild, wide with a terror that did not belong to the quiet barn, but to some other, more terrible place. For a moment, he stared right through her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, slowly, his gaze focused. He saw her, the lantern held aloft, her face filled with concern. The raw vulnerability in his expression was a stark, shocking contrast to the stoic mask he wore every day. The wildness faded, replaced by confusion, and then by a deep, hollowed-out shame. He offered no explanation. He simply sat there, breathing heavily, running a hand over his face as if to wipe the dream away. And she did not ask for one. She knew, with an instinct that went deeper than words, that she had just witnessed the source of all his pain. In that moment, standing in the cold, dark barn, lit only by the flickering flame of a single lantern, their relationship shifted again. He had seen the depths of her desperation on the day he arrived. Now, she had been allowed a glimpse into his deepest wound. It was a new, more profound level of intimacy, forged not in comfort, but in a shared understanding of nocturnal terrors. The part closes as the season began its slow, inevitable turn toward autumn. The relentless heat of summer softened, and the mornings carried a new, crisp edge. The fields they had cleared and plowed, the ones that had cost them so much sweat and pain, now showed the first tender green shoots of a promising wheat crop. The ranch, once a symbol of decay and surrender, now hummed with the quiet, persistent energy of renewal. The fence lines were straight and true. The barn door hung square on new hinges, and the pump delivered a steady stream of clear, cold water. The same could be said for the two people who had resurrected it. Their uneasy alliance, born of debt and desperation, had transformed into a genuine partnership. It was a thing built not of grand declarations, but of small, solid moments, of shared labor under a punishing sun, of a quiet understanding of a common enemy, of a gentle hand tending a wound, and of a silent vigil kept in the dark. Standing on the porch one evening, they looked out at the land they had brought back to life together. For the first time, a sustainable future seemed within reach, a tangible thing they could almost hold in their hands. Yet, the menacing shadow of Silas Croft loomed large on their horizon, and the unspoken truths of their own tragic pasts remained a chasm they had not yet learned how to cross. Months of relentless labor had yielded a tangible result. The ranch was breathing again, but their supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. The salt barrel was empty, the flour sack held only dust, and the coffee was a memory. A trip to the town of Clayton, a place Alara had actively avoided since her husband's funeral, was no longer a choice but a necessity. They rode in the small farm wagon, Jedediah handling the reins of the single draft horse while Alara sat beside him on the hard wooden seat. The journey itself was quiet, the landscape familiar in its harsh beauty. But it was a different kind of quiet from the one they shared at the ranch. This silence was filled with a low hum of apprehension, a shared understanding that they were leaving their fragile sanctuary and entering a world that had already judged and condemned her. As they reached the outskirts of Clayton, the change was immediate. The open silence of the prairie was replaced by the sounds of civilization, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the distant laughter of children, the murmur of conversation. To Jedediah, who had spent a decade avoiding such places, it was a discordant noise. To Alara, it was the sound of her own exile. They tied the wagon in front of the general store and stepped onto the wooden boardwalk. It was as if a chill wind had blown down the dusty main street, A group of women clustered near the dressmaker's shop fell silent, their chatter ceasing as if cut by a knife. They turned as one, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cold disapproval. One of them, a woman Ilara had known since childhood, instinctively pulled her young son behind her skirts, as if Ilara were a carrier of some moral plague. Hands rose to cover whispering mouths, and hostile eyes followed them, dissecting Ilara's patched but clean dress and lingering on the tall, armed stranger at her side. As they walked, the town preacher, Reverend Miller, emerged from the church. He was a man whose piety was as starched and severe as his collar. He saw them together, and his face hardened into a mask of biblical condemnation. He gave a curt, dismissive nod to Ilara and stared at Jedediah with an expression that promised hellfire and damnation for them both. He did not speak a word, but his judgment was as loud and clear as his Sunday sermons. The feeling of being watched, of being weighed and found wanting, was a physical pressure. Ilara felt her shoulders slump, the old shame washing over her. She had told Jedediah of her isolation, but for him to see it, to walk through it with her, was a new and profound humiliation. Inside the general store, the air was cool and smelled of pickle brine, leather, and coffee beans. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a balding man with a perpetually sour expression, was polishing the counter with a rag. He looked up as they entered, and his face soured further when he saw Ilara. "Afternoon, Ilara," he said, his tone brusque. He turned his attention back to the counter, deliberately ignoring her. Another customer, the wife of a local farmer, came to the counter, and Henderson served her immediately, making small talk about the weather and the price of corn, all while Ilara and Jedediah stood waiting in silence. When the other woman had left, Ilara finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I need salt, Mr. Henderson, and flour, if you can spare it." Henderson sighed, as if she were a great burden. "And how will you be paying for this? Your credit here is concluded." Before Ilara could answer, Jedediah moved. It was not a large or aggressive movement, but it changed the entire dynamic of the room. He simply shifted his position, stepping from behind Ilara to stand beside her, his tall frame suddenly dominating the space in front of the counter. He did not speak. He did not have to. He rested his hands on the wooden counter, his presence radiating a dangerous stillness that was far more intimidating than any spoken threat. He met Mr. Henderson's gaze, his own eyes as cold and hard as flint. The proprietor's demeanor underwent an instant and remarkable transformation. The sour look vanished, replaced by a nervous, placating smile. He suddenly became a whirlwind of activity. Of course, salt and flour, right away, Mrs. Vance," he chirped, his voice a full octave higher. "And some coffee? I have a fresh grind. And you, sir, anything I can get for you? Some cartridges, perhaps? Tobacco?" Jedediah said nothing. He simply held the storekeeper's gaze until the man scurried away to fill their order. He had not raised his voice or made a single threat. But his simple act of standing slightly in front of her, of absorbing the hostility and reflecting it back with a silent, unwavering intensity, was a more powerful defense than any words could have been. In that moment, he was not her creditor or her partner, he was her shield. Later, while Ilara waited with the wagon, carefully stowing their precious supplies, Jedediah told her he needed to buy a replacement shear pin for the plow. He walked down the street toward the saloon, the only place in town that also served as an impromptu hardware supplier for men in a hurry. The moment he pushed through the swinging doors, the familiar atmosphere of stale whiskey, sweat, and cheap cigar smoke enveloped him. The air was thick and gray, the light from the dusty windows barely cutting through the gloom. A few men were playing cards at a corner table, their voices a low murmur. Two others stood at the bar, their backs to the room. They were loud, their tongues loosened by drink. Jedediah recognized them instantly as two of Silas Croft's ranch hands, the same men who had flanked their employer on his visit to the ranch. He walked to the far end of the bar, ordered a beer he had no intention of drinking, and asked the bartender about the part he needed. As the bartender rummaged under the counter, Jedediah listened. Croft's men were boasting, their voices carrying easily in the quiet saloon. They spoke of their boss's power, the size of his herd, the fear he commanded in the county. "He always gets what he wants," the younger one slurred, slamming his glass on the bar for emphasis. "Always. You remember that fella Vance? Thought he was tough, thought he could say no to the boss." The older man grunted. "He was a fool, a stubborn fool." "More than stubborn." The young one laughed, a high, ugly sound. "The boss told us to just talk to him, persuade him a little. Up at the ravine, we cornered him there, just like the boss said. Told him he ought to sign the papers for that South Canyon spring, that he was being a bad neighbor." The man took a long drink, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He got real angry, started shouting. It all just happened after that. Stupid fool couldn't hold his liquor or his horse. Their story was cut short when the older man noticed Jedediah. He saw the cold, focused attention in the stranger's eyes and nudged his partner hard in the ribs. They both fell silent, turning back to their drinks. Jedediah paid the bartender for the pin and the beer. Leaving the glass untouched, he picked up the small piece of metal and turned, not toward the door, but toward the two men. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that was almost feline. He cornered the younger one, the loudmouth, against the bar, boxing him in. He did not raise his voice. In fact, it dropped to a near whisper, a sound more menacing than any shout. "Tell me about the South Canyon spring," he said. The man flinched, trying to look past Jedediah to his partner for help, but Jedediah shifted his weight, blocking his view. "I do not know what you are talking about." Thomas Vance's argument with Croft. Jedediah pressed, his voice flat and cold. It was about the spring, was it not? The threat of violence hung in the air between them, as real and as sharp as a knife's edge. He did not touch the man, but the promise of what he was capable of was plain in his eyes. The man's drunken bravado evaporated, replaced by a pale, sweaty fear. "It was just business," he stammered. "Vance was being unreasonable. Croft just wanted us to explain the situation to him, that is all. He got agitated. He fell. It was an accident." "An accident," Jedediah repeated, the words toneless. He had heard what he needed to hear. He held the man's terrified gaze for one more second, then stepped back, releasing him from the invisible cage of his presence. He turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving the two men in a stunned, sobered silence. The ride back to the ranch was fraught with a new, heavy tension, the hostility they had faced in town, and the terrible confirmation Jedediah now carried had dismantled the last of the careful barriers between them. The vast, empty landscape, which had once felt isolating, now seemed to invite confession. The sky was a huge, open witness. Jedediah drove the wagon in a dark, contemplative silence, his jaw set like granite. Ilara watched his profile, the hard lines of his face thrown into sharp relief by the setting sun. She could feel the storm raging within him, and she finally gathered the courage to ask about the name that had haunted her since she had heard it cried out in the dark of the barn. "Jedediah," she began, her voice soft, testing the weight of his full name. He did not turn. "The night I came to the barn, you were dreaming. You said a name, Sarah." He rode in silence for a full mile, the only sound the steady clopping of the horse and the creak of the wagon wheels. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. She thought he would not answer, that he would retreat once more behind his wall. Then, in a low, gravelly voice that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul, he began to speak. "Sarah was my wife," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We had a daughter, Lily. She was 6 years old." He spoke of a life that felt like it belonged to another man. They were homesteaders in Colorado, building a life from nothing but their own two hands and a fierce love for each other. He described their small cabin, built from pine he had felled himself, the way the light looked coming through the window in the morning. He spoke of Sarah's laugh and of Lily's habit of collecting wildflowers, her small hands always full of Indian paintbrush and bluebells. "There was a man there," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion now, like a man reciting a legal report. "A rancher, name of McLeod. He was cut from the same cloth as Croft. He wanted our land, not for the grass, but for the creek that ran through it. It was the only year-round water for 10 miles. Jedediah had refused to sell. The land was their future, their daughter's inheritance. McLeod had made threats, but Jedediah had stood his ground. I had to leave for a cattle drive, just like this last one. I was gone for 2 months. His voice began to fray at the edges. McLeod and his sons, they did not want to wait for the law. The law was on their payroll anyway. They waited for a moonless night when I was 100 miles away. He stopped speaking. The wagon creaked on. The silence was terrible. They set fire to the cabin, he finally said, the words rough, as if dragged over stones. I came home to a smoldering ruin, the smell of burned pine. It never leaves you. He swallowed hard, his throat working. Our neighbor had buried them. 2 small mounds of fresh earth under the big cottonwood where Lily used to play. He said the law called it a terrible accident, a lantern overturned. Elara felt her own heart shatter, the pieces grinding together in her chest. The immense, unimaginable tragedy he had carried, alone, for all these years, was a weight she could now feel herself. I did not wait for their justice. Jedediah's voice was a low growl now, the sound of something breaking deep inside. I hunted them down, McLeod and his 2 boys. I found them one by one, and I killed them. He stated it as a fact, not a confession, a simple and brutal equation of loss and retribution. That act made me a fugitive, a drifter, the man I was, the man Sarah and Lily knew. He died in that fire with them. I have been running ever since. He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw a desolation so complete it stole her breath. The gold, Elara, the $200, it was never for a new start. It was for an end. Enough money to buy passage on a ship, to go somewhere so far away that the memories could no longer find me. A place with no smell of pine. The confession was a raw, agonizing act of trust, and it left him completely exposed. The walls he had spent a decade building, now a pile of rubble at his feet. His silence, she now understood, was not indifference but a prison of grief. His hardness was not cruelty, but the thick, ugly scar tissue over a mortal wound. When his voice finally broke on his daughter's name, a choked, rasping sound of pure agony. Elara acted without thought. She wordlessly reached across the space between them and took his hand. His hand was rough and calloused, but it trembled in her grasp. She offered no empty words of comfort, no useless platitudes about time or healing. She simply held on, her touch a silent acknowledgement of his pain, a communion of shared and terrible loss. In that single, profound moment, her feelings for him underwent a final, irrevocable transformation. The gratitude and respect she felt for him deepened into a fierce, protective love, a desperate desire to be an anchor for this man who had been adrift for so long in an endless sea of sorrow. When they arrived back at the ranch under a sky full of cold, distant stars, they found that Silas Croft had escalated his campaign. He had not waited. A crude dam of rock, mud, and felled logs had been built across the narrow creek that fed their well, the lifeblood of their land. The water behind the dam was already pooling, while on their side, the creek bed was a ribbon of wet mud, the flow reduced to a pathetic trickle. The direct, devastating attack erased any doubt about Croft's ruthlessness. They were no longer just fighting for a dead man's honor. They were in a desperate struggle for their own survival. For the next several days, they worked with a silent, frantic energy, digging a new irrigation trench by hand. They would divert water from a smaller, more distant spring high in the rocks, a source Croft had likely overlooked. The work was punishing, pushing them to the absolute limits of their physical endurance. They dug from sunup to sundown, their bodies caked in mud, their muscles screaming in protest. One evening, utterly exhausted, they stood at the pump, taking turns washing the thick grime from their faces and arms. Ilara, her hair heavy with dust and mud, struggled to rinse it, the task seeming impossibly difficult. Seeing her frustration, Jedediah wordlessly took the bucket of cool, clean water from her. He moved to stand behind her. His movements were slow and deliberate as he poured the water over her head, the cool stream a shocking, wonderful relief. Then, he did something that made her breath catch in her throat. He gently, almost reverently, began to work his calloused fingers through her long, tangled hair, untangling the knots, washing the dirt away. The act was shockingly intimate. His touch was not one of passion, but of profound, tender care. In the fading light of dusk, with the sound of trickling water and their own ragged breaths filling the air, the simmering desire that had been building between them for weeks finally ignited. She tilted her head back, her eyes closing. She could feel him standing inches away, his presence a solid, warm wall at her back. The world narrowed to the feel of his hands in her hair, the scent of rain-soaked earth, and the sound of his breathing. The air between them grew thick with unspoken need. He stopped, his hands resting for a moment on her shoulders. She turned her head to look up at him. He was looking down at her, his expression one of longing and a deep, soul-wrenching conflict. He looked as if he was about to kiss her, but then she saw the ghosts rise in his eyes, the shadow of a woman named Sarah, a little girl with a handful of wildflowers, and she knew he could not. He pulled back, his hands dropping from her shoulders. The moment of longing left painfully unresolved, but the charge between them was now an undeniable, living thing. A current had been established, and neither of them knew where it would lead. The part ends with a small, hard-won victory. After 4 days of back-breaking labor, the new trench was finished. They watched together as a trickle of life-giving water, stolen back from the indifferent hills, began to flow toward their thirsty fields. They had won another battle against Croft, a victory forged in shared sweat and pain that had bound them together inextricably. Jedediah's soul-bearing confession had allowed Ilara to see the true man, and her quiet, unwavering compassion had begun to mend a part of him he had long ago given up for dead. But now they were not just partners in survival, they were keepers of each other's most painful secrets, facing an enemy who had proven he would stop at nothing. Their love, fragile and new, was taking root in the most dangerous of soils. Against all odds, the land began to give back. The seeds they had sown in desperation, nourished by the diverted spring and their own sweat, took root and grew with a stubborn vitality that mirrored their own. The harvest arrived with the turning of the season, the air growing crisp in the mornings, the sun losing its brutal edge and casting a softer golden light across the plains. It was not a bounty, not the kind of crop that would make a man rich, but it was enough. The wheat stood tall and golden, its heads heavy. The small vegetable patch yielded a surprising wealth of squash, beans, and potatoes. It was enough to see them through the long, cold winter that was coming, and enough to have a small surplus to take to market. It was, in its own quiet way, a miracle. The scenes of their work in the fields changed. The frantic, punishing labor of survival was replaced by a new, quiet harmony. They moved with an unspoken rhythm, a silent conversation conducted through shared purpose. He would scythe a row of wheat, and she would be there behind him, gathering and binding the sheaves. They anticipated each other's movements, their separate efforts weaving together into a single, efficient whole, the harsh landscape, once their unyielding adversary, now felt like a tacit accomplice, a silent partner that had finally decided to reward their perseverance. For a brief, golden period, they knew a profound sense of peace. The evenings were spent on the porch, the silence between them no longer a space of caution, but one of comfortable companionship. They were building something more than a harvest. They were building a life. One afternoon, while they were gathering the last of the pumpkins from the vine, the fragile peace was punctuated by a sound the ranch had not heard in years. Ilara was carrying a particularly large pumpkin, its weight awkward in her arms. She stumbled on an unseen rock, and the pumpkin slipped from her grasp. It landed with a soft thud and began to roll, slowly at first, then gaining speed as it found the gentle slope of the field. "Oh, stop it!" she cried out, half in frustration and half in amusement as she scrambled after it. The pumpkin, round and orange and seeming to possess a mind of its own, bounced and dodged her grasping hands. Jedediah, watching from the wagon, saw her lunge and miss, landing in a heap in the dirt. And then it came, a sound he had never heard from her, a sound of pure, unbridled laughter. It was not a small chuckle, but a full, rich laugh that seemed to bubble up from the very center of her being. The sound startled him. It was so out of place in this world of struggle and silence that for a moment he did not know what it was. He watched her, sitting in the dirt with her hair coming loose from its pins, laughing at the runaway pumpkin that had finally come to rest against a fence post. And then, a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred in his own chest. A smile, a real one, tugged at the corner of his mouth, and a low chuckle escaped his lips. He walked over to her, extending a hand to help her up. She took it, still laughing, and for a moment they just stood there, his hand holding hers, the sound of her hope echoing in the golden afternoon. But the fragile peace could not quell the need for justice that gnawed at Jedediah. The ledger and the drunken words of Croft's men were a poison in his mind. He knew, with a cold certainty, that as long as the truth of Thomas Vance's death remained buried, Silas Croft's shadow would forever loom over them, a promise of violence yet to come. To protect the peace they had found, he had to confront the past. One morning, telling Alara only that he was going to check the fences along the southern line, he saddled Jericho and rode out towards the South Canyon. He did not go to the ravine where Thomas's body had been found, but to the small, secluded spring a quarter-mile upstream, the spring Thomas had mentioned in his ledger. The area was quiet, a shallow basin of rock and sparse grass where the water seeped from the ground. Jedediah dismounted, his senses on high alert. He was no longer a ranch hand, he was a tracker, his eyes scanning the ground, reading the subtle language of the earth. He began a slow, circling search. It did not take long. Near a cluster of rocks, something glinted in the morning sun. He knelt and carefully brushed away the dirt, shards of dark green glass. He picked up the largest piece. It was thick, part of the bottom of a whiskey bottle. He turned it over in his palm. He had seen bottles just like it in the saloon in Clayton. He remembered Alara mentioning, months ago, that the town doctor had noted finding pieces of a broken bottle near Thomas's body. He widened his search. The ground near the rocks was scuffed. The earth churned in a way that was not natural. He saw the deep, gouged marks of boot heels digging in. The kind of marks a man makes when he is resisting, fighting to keep his feet. There was a larger patch of disturbed earth, as if a body had fallen or been thrown down. He followed the faint trail of broken twigs and flattened grass toward the edge of the ravine. Then he turned his attention to the hoofprints. The official story was of a lone, drunken rider, but Jedediah found the faint, overlapping tracks of at least 3 horses, their prints intermingled in the hard-packed earth near the spring. 3 horses had waited here, 1 had arrived, and only 3 had left together. The physical evidence painted a clear, brutal picture. It was exactly as the young ranch hand had drunkenly confessed. Croft and his men had ambushed Thomas here, at the spring that was the source of their dispute. They had tried to intimidate him, to force him to sign away his water rights. Thomas, a proud and stubborn man, would have refused. A struggle had ensued, and in the heat of anger and whiskey, they had killed him. Then, they had thrown his body into the ravine, smashing the whiskey bottle nearby to complete the grim tableau of a drunken fall. It was not just a convenient accident. It was murder. Jedediah returned to the ranch as dusk was settling, the sky painted in the same bruised colors as the evening he had confessed his own dark past to Alara. His expression was a grim mask of certainty. She was on the porch, mending one of his shirts by the fading light, and she looked up as he rode in. She saw his face and knew, instantly, and with a sinking heart, that he had found something. She set the shirt aside, her hands still. He did not dismount immediately, but sat on his horse for a moment, looking at her, at the small, solid cabin, at the fields they had resurrected together. He looked at the home they had made. Then he swung down from the saddle and walked toward her, his steps heavy. He stood before her on the porch and laid out the evidence, his voice low and steady, each word a carefully placed stone building a wall of terrible truth. He told her about the glass, the signs of a violent struggle, the tracks of the 3 horses. He connected it all to the ledger and to the words he had overheard in the saloon. He did not soften the blow. He gave her the truth, hard and unvarnished. "Your husband did not fall, Elara," he concluded, his voice gentle but firm. "He was not a drunk who shamed you. He was a man who stood up to a thief, and he was murdered for his integrity." The news was a complex and devastating blow. The grief for her husband, which had dulled to a quiet ache, returned with a raw, sharp intensity. She wept for Thomas, for the violent, lonely end he had met. A hot, furious rage at Silas Croft burned in her chest, a rage so pure it felt like it might consume her. But beneath the grief and the anger, there was another, stranger feeling, a quiet, profound sense of vindication. The cloud of shame she had lived under for so long, the whispers and the cold stares, the judgment of an entire town, it all finally dissipated, blown away by the force of this terrible truth. Her husband was not a disgrace. He was a hero. She looked at Jedediah, his face a study in grim sympathy in the twilight. He had done this for her. He had sought the truth when no one else would even listen, when the law itself had declared the case closed. He had given her back her husband's honor. Overwhelmed by a torrent of emotions too powerful to contain, gratitude so immense it felt like a physical force, she rose from her chair and crossed the small space between them. The emotional dam they had both so carefully maintained for months finally shattered. All the unspoken longing, the shared pain, the terror and the hope, it all crested in a single, unstoppable wave. She reached up, her hand trembling slightly as she traced the hard, unforgiving line of his jaw. He looked down at her, the sorrow in his eyes warring with a deep, desperate tenderness, and then he leaned down to meet her. Their first kiss was not gentle or tentative. It was a desperate, consuming collision. It was the frantic, hungry kiss of 2 people who had been starved for comfort, for connection, for life itself. It was fueled by months of unspoken desire, of shared hardship, of the terrifying, constant proximity of death. His arms went around her, pulling her tight against him as if he were afraid she might disappear. Her hands tangled in his hair, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had tried to drown her. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and grief and, finally, of a desperate, hard-won salvation. The raw, undeniable honesty of their kiss led them from the porch into the dim, quiet sanctuary of the cabin. The world outside, with its threats and its ghosts, ceased to exist. There was only the small, safe space of the room, lit by a single kerosene lamp that cast a warm, soft glow on the rough-hewn walls. What followed was not an act of simple passion, but one of profound healing and reclamation. The prose of their movements was simple, their actions speaking to the deep, emotional gravity of the moment. In a world defined by hardship and violence, they discovered a startling tenderness in each other. His calloused hands, which knew only the rough work of survival, learned to be gentle, to cherish. Her touch, in turn, offered a solace that he had believed was lost to him forever. For Jedediah, it was a terrifying step back into a life he thought had been burned to ash. As he held her, the ghost of his wife, a memory he had clung to like a penance, began to recede. It was an act of letting go, not of the love he had felt for Sarah, but of the grief that had defined him. He was choosing to embrace the living, breathing woman in his arms, to allow himself a future when he had been resigned to living forever in the ruins of his past. For Elara, it was an affirmation of life and desire. She was no longer just Thomas Vance's grieving widow, a woman defined by her husband's tragic end. She was herself, a woman with needs, with strength, with the capacity for a love that was fierce and new. It was a defiant choice to claim a future for herself, to insist on happiness in a world that had offered her only sorrow. Their union was not an escape from their tragedies. It was a quiet, solemn consecration of their survival. The morning after, everything had changed. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, they awoke to a new reality. The silence between them was no longer one of wary distance or even comfortable companionship. It was a silence of deep, easy intimacy. They moved around the small cabin with a new, unspoken grace, their bodies orbiting each other in a familiar, comfortable dance. He brushed his shoulder against hers as he passed to stoke the embers in the hearth, a casual touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her. She placed his morning coffee on the table, and her hand lingered on his for a moment longer than necessary, a small, silent acknowledgement of the bond that now connected them. They were no longer just allies or partners. They were a unit, bound by a shared past, a shared love, and a shared resolve to face whatever was coming. Their newfound peace, born in a night of truth and tenderness, was short-lived. Late that afternoon, a single rider approached the ranch. It was Silas Croft, alone. The mask of civility he usually wore was gone, stripped away to reveal the cold, undisguised menace beneath. He rode right up to the cabin and dismounted, his movements arrogant and proprietary. "I heard you were asking questions in town." "Stone," Croft said, his voice a low sneer. He did not look at Jedediah, but at Alara, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "And that you took a ride out to the South Canyon, looking for ghosts." "I found what I was looking for," Jedediah said, moving to stand between Croft and Alara. Croft laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You are not the only one who has been asking questions. It seems you have quite a history. Mr. Stone, a man of your reputation should not be so careless. Tell me." "Alara," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Does it bother you, taking up with a known killer?" He made it clear, with that single, venomous question, that he knew the dark history that had driven Jedediah from Colorado. He then delivered his ultimatum, his voice dropping to a flat, deadly tone. "This game is over. I have a deed of sale drawn up in my pocket. You will sign this ranch over to me, Alara. In return, I will allow you and your fugitive lover to ride away with your lives. You have until sundown tomorrow." "And if I refuse?" Alara asked, her voice trembling but defiant. Croft's eyes glinted with a cold fire. "If you refuse, I will burn you out. I hear your man has some experience with that. A cabin full of family can make quite a blaze, can it not? Stone?" He smiled, a predator's smile. "And do not think the law will help you. The law in this county is what I say it is. No one in that town will lift a single finger to help you." The threat, so personal and so cruel, left Alara shaken to her very core. After Croft had ridden away, her first instinct was to flee. She turned to Jedediah, her eyes wide with terror. "He is right," she pleaded. "We cannot fight him, not alone. Let us take the money we will get from the harvest and just go. We can leave tonight, start a new life somewhere else, a place where no one knows either of us. Together." It was a testament to the depth of her love that she was willing to abandon the land she had fought tooth and nail to save, if it meant saving him. But Jedediah, for the first time in 10 years, stood his ground. He took her hands in his grip firm and steadying. He looked into her eyes, and the haunted, running man she had come to know was gone. In his place was a man who had finally found his footing. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Running is all I have ever done, Alara. I ran from my grief. I ran from my memories. I ran from myself. I will not run anymore." He looked past her, at the fields, at the cabin, at the small piece of the world they had built together. "That man is the same evil that destroyed my life once. I will not let him do it again. I will not let him take this from us. His love for her, and the home they had forged, had done what years of solitary, aimless wandering could not. It had given him something worth fighting for. It had given him a reason to stop running. His conviction was a fire that burned away her fear, bolstering her own courage. Looking into his determined eyes, she knew he was right. They had come too far, fought too hard. To turn and run now, they would not run. They would fight for their home. The part ends with them standing together on the porch, a united front against the coming darkness. On the western horizon, a bank of dark, bruised-looking storm clouds was gathering, a perfect mirror of the violence they knew was on its way. Their brief, idyllic moment of love and peace had passed. They spent the rest of the evening in grim, purposeful silence, boarding up the cabin's windows, cleaning their rifles, and stacking cartridges on the small wooden table. They had found each other in the ruins of their lives, but in doing so, they had made themselves a target. The fight was no longer for land or for justice. It was for the future they had only just begun to believe was possible. The sun set, not with a gentle fade, but as if it were being violently extinguished, smothered by the bank of bruised, angry clouds rolling in from the west. As the last light died, the world went unnervingly still. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with a palpable tension. Inside the small, fortified cabin, Ilara and Jedediah waited. Every window was boarded, leaving only thin slits through which to see and shoot. A rifle lay across Ilara's lap. Jedediah stood near the door, his Winchester held loosely in his hands, his body a study in coiled stillness. The first drop of rain struck the tin roof with the force of a thrown stone, then another and another, until it was a relentless, hammering drumbeat. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful cry that rose in pitch to a furious shriek. The storm broke over the ranch with the same savage ferocity as the violence they knew was coming. The darkness outside became absolute, a solid wall of blackness that seemed to press in on the small cabin. It was a darkness punctuated by brilliant, terrifying flashes of lightning that bleached the world white for a split second, revealing the thrashing trees and the rain-swept yard in stark, ghostly snapshots. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every rattle of a loose board, was amplified by the storm into a potential threat. The attack, when it came, began not with the sharp crack of a gunshot, but with a silent, insidious bloom of light. Against the black canvas of the night, an unnatural orange glow began to flicker and grow. Jedediah moved to the slit in the door, his face grim. Ilara joined him, her heart sinking with a cold, sickening dread. The barn was on fire. Flames, hungry and orange, were already licking up the dry timber walls, greedily consuming the structure they had so painstakingly rebuilt. It was a visceral, personal blow. Every post, every plank in that barn represented weeks of their shared labor, a testament to their defiance and their hope. To see it being devoured by fire was to watch that hope burn. The sight was a direct assault on their spirit, a cruel and calculated act of psychological warfare. The fire served a clear purpose, to draw them out of the fortified cabin, to divide their attention, to break them with grief and rage before the first shot was even fired. A wave of despair washed over Ilara. But Jedediah Stone was not so easily broken. Years of solitary survival had honed his instincts into a razor-sharp weapon. He had anticipated a direct assault, had spent the afternoon preparing for it, and while the fire was a cruel blow, it did not make him panic. It made him cold. "Stay away from the door," he said, his voice a low, calm command that cut through the roar of the wind and flames. "He wants us to run out and try to save it. He wants us in the open." He and Ilara moved through the dimly lit cabin like a well-oiled machine, their deep connection now a matter of life and death. He took up a position by the front window, using the flickering firelight to scan the chaos outside. She moved to a side window that looked out into deeper darkness, her own rifle ready. Far from being a liability, Ilara was an active, vital participant in their defense. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her hands were steady as she checked the load in her rifle, her movements sure. Her eyes, sharp and focused, peered into the storm-tossed night. Her presence at his back, her quiet courage, was a source of silent strength for Jedediah. She was not just fighting for a piece of land anymore. She was fighting for the man she loved, for the future she had dared to believe in. The first gunshot came a moment later, a sharp crack that was nearly lost in a clap of thunder. A splinter of wood flew from the doorframe near Jedediah's head. He did not flinch. He raised his Winchester, waited for a flash of lightning to illuminate a shadowy figure moving near the woodpile, and fired. A cry of pain was ripped away by the wind. The battle had begun. It was not a chaotic free-for-all, but a tense, strategic game of cat and mouse. Jedediah used the storm as his greatest ally. The howling wind and hammering rain masked their sounds, while the intermittent flashes of lightning served as his reconnaissance, giving him brief, stark glimpses of the battlefield. He knew the layout of this ranch intimately. Every rock, every dip in the terrain, every shadow. Croft's hired men, stumbling through the mud and unfamiliar darkness, were at a severe disadvantage. He and Alara were a fortress, their crossfire covering the main approaches to the cabin. For what felt like an eternity, the night was a chaotic symphony of violence. The roar of the fire, the howl of the wind, the crash of thunder, and the sporadic, deadly punctuation of rifle shots. They held their ground, their defense unbreakable. Frustrated by their tenacious resistance, his initial plan in ruins, Silas Croft resorted to a crueler weapon, psychological warfare, hiding in the darkness beyond the firelight. He began to shout. His powerful voice carried on the gusts of wind, a disembodied taunt from the heart of the storm. He did not shout threats or demands. He aimed his venom with surgical precision at the deepest, most vulnerable part of Jedediah's soul. "Stone!" the voice howled. "Does this remind you of another night, another fire?" Jedediah froze, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. "I heard all about your little family in Colorado. Killer!" Croft's voice was laced with a triumphant cruelty. "I can almost smell it from here. That smell of burning pine, can you smell it, Stone?" Alara looked over at Jedediah, her heart clenching with fear for him. His face had gone pale, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. "Her name was Sarah, was it not?" Croft screamed, his voice rising with manic glee. "Did she scream for you, Stone? Did she call your name while the flames took her?" For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, Croft's poison worked. Hearing his dead wife's name used as a weapon by a man like this, a man of such casual evil, sent a tremor of the old, paralyzing grief through Jedediah. The roar of the burning barn outside merged with the roar of the fire from his memory. The smell of smoke was suddenly sharper, thicker, filled with a decade of loss and guilt. He could see it. The cabin in Colorado, the black sky, the terrible orange light. He could hear Sarah's scream. The past rose up to claim him, the ghosts he had run from for so long swarming around him, threatening to drag him down into a helplessness he had sworn he would never feel again. But then, in the flickering lamplight of the cabin, he glanced at Alara. She was looking at him, her face pale with fear, but her expression was not one of pity. It was one of fierce, unwavering resolve. She held his gaze, her eyes full of a strength that was both her own and a reflection of his. The sight of her, so alive, so present, so resolute, was an anchor. It pulled him from the raging sea of his memory and planted him firmly in the violent reality of the now. The past was no longer a weight that could paralyze him with loss. It was fuel. The memory of the fire did not break him, it forged him. A cold, righteous fury, purer and hotter than any flame, burned away the grief. He would not lose another family. He would not stand by while the same evil tried to burn his world down a second time. This was his final, defiant stand against the ghosts that had haunted his every waking moment for 10 years. The shift inside him was palpable, a physical change. The tension in his shoulders resolved into a lethal readiness. He turned to Alara, his eyes clear and hard as diamonds. "Keep the windows covered. Do not fire unless they breach the porch. I am going out." Before she could protest, he was gone, slipping out the back door of the cabin and melting into the storm like a phantom. The man who had been a defender now became a hunter. He moved with a newfound, lethal grace, using the chaos of the storm as his cloak. The wind hid the sound of his footsteps, and the torrential rain washed his tracks away the moment they were made. He was a force of nature in his own right, an avenging spirit driven by a protective instinct that had lain dormant for nearly a decade. He circled wide, coming up behind the first of Croft's men, who was taking cover behind the water trough. The man was focused on the front of the cabin, expecting an attack from that direction. He never heard Jedediah approach. A swift, brutal blow from the butt of Jedediah's rifle, and the man crumpled into the mud without a sound. He moved on, a ghost in the maelstrom. He used a flash of lightning to spot the next man near the collapsed fence line. He moved through the darkness, his actions swift and brutally efficient. He was not the vengeful wraith of his past, killing for retribution. He was a protector, disabling the threat with a cold, precise economy of violence. One by one, he incapacitated Croft's men, leaving them bound and disarmed in the dark. The battle ultimately narrowed to a primal confrontation between two men. As Jedediah neutralized the last of his men, Silas Croft, realizing his plan was collapsing, finally showed himself. He stood in the mud-soaked yard, halfway between the cabin and the dying, smoldering ruin of the barn. Rain plastered his hair to his skull, and his face, illuminated by the red glow of the embers, was a mask of pure rage. He drew his pistol and fired wildly at the shadows. "Come out and face me, Stone, you coward!" Jedediah stepped out from behind the corner of the well house, his own pistol in his hand. For a moment, they faced each other across the devastated yard. Then, with a roar of fury, Croft charged. It was a raw, desperate fight in the mud and the rain. Croft was physically larger, a bull of a man fueled by greed and a lifetime of getting his own way. Jedediah was leaner, faster, and fueled by something far more powerful, a desperate, burning need for redemption, and a love that had given him a reason to live again. They crashed together, grappling in the slick mud. It was a fight for the soul of the land, and for Jedediah's own soul. A brutal blow from Croft sent Jedediah reeling, but he recovered, dodging a wild swing and landing a solid punch to Croft's jaw. They went down, rolling in the muck, the embers of the barn casting a hellish light on their struggle. Jedediah finally gained the advantage. He managed to pin Croft's gun arm with his knee and brought the barrel of his own Colt revolver up, pressing it hard against Croft's chest. The fight was over. In this moment, gasping for breath in the pouring rain, he faced the ultimate choice. The old Jedediah, the vengeful ghost who had hunted down the men who destroyed his family, would have pulled the trigger without a second's thought. It would have been justice. It would have been vengeance. It would have been easy. Croft, pinned and defeated, even goaded him. "Go on, do it, killer," he spat, his voice a ragged gasp. "You think this changes anything? I killed that fool Vance, and I would have killed you and your woman too." Jedediah looked down at the pathetic, hate-filled man at his feet. The urge to end it, to silence that voice forever, was a powerful, primal thing. But then, he looked past Croft, toward the small cabin. A warm square of light glowed from the slit in the window. He knew Alara was in there, waiting for him. To kill Croft now would be an act of vengeance, an act that would chain him to the violence of his past forever. He would become the killer Croft named him, the man he had been running from for 10 years. To spare him, to put his faith in a form of justice he had long since forsaken, was to choose the future. It was to choose Alara. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the gun. He leaned in close, his voice a cold, steady whisper against the rain. "The sheriff in Clayton is your man. We both know that. But he is not the only law in this territory." He stood up, pulling a rope from his belt. "You are not going to him. I am taking you and what is left of your men to the next county, to a U.S. Marshal. You will face a federal court for the murder of Thomas Vance, and I will be there to testify. It was a victory not of passion, but of principle. It was the choice of a man who was no longer a ghost, but who was ready to live in the world of the living. The part concludes as the first gray, watery light of dawn broke through the retreating storm clouds. The rain had softened to a drizzle and then stopped, leaving behind a world that was washed clean but deeply scarred. The barn was a smoldering, blackened skeleton, a gaping wound on the land. Croft and his surviving, groaning men were bound and secured near the woodpile. Jedediah, bruised, muddy, and utterly exhausted, stood over them, the victor. The cabin door creaked open, and Alara ran out. She did not stop until she was in his arms, holding him with a desperate, trembling strength. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her rain-soaked hair, and they just held each other tightly amidst the devastation. They had survived the fire. They had survived the storm. The battle was won. But the cost was etched into the ravaged landscape and into their weary, triumphant faces. The dawn that followed the storm was eerily quiet. The wind had died, the rain had ceased, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. The air, washed clean by the downpour, carried the sharp, acrid scent of wet ash from the smoldering ruin of the barn. In the surreal calm of the new day, Jedediah, Alara, and their bound. Defeated prisoners seemed like the only people left in the world. True to his word, Jedediah bypassed Clayton, leaving Alara with a rifle and a solemn promise to return. He loaded Silas Croft and his 2 conscious men into their own wagon and set off on the long, grim ride to the next county. He returned 2 days later, not alone, but accompanied by a tall, gaunt man with a sweeping mustache and a pair of eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore a dusty coat and a badge that gleamed with the authority of the United States government. He was a U.S. Marshal named Elias Thorne, and he was the embodiment of a justice they had almost given up on. Marshal Thorne was a man of few words and methodical action. He listened to Jedediah's account, then to Alara's, his gaze patient and assessing as they spoke. He had them guide him to the South Canyon Spring, where he knelt and examined the ground with a practiced eye, taking note of the scuffed earth and the shards of glass. He read the hurried, anxious entries in Thomas Vance's ledger, his expression unreadable. By the time he was done, he had heard their story not just in their words, but in the evidence etched into the land itself. He took Silas Croft and his men into federal custody. As he led Croft away in shackles, the landowner's mask of arrogant power finally crumbled, replaced by the pale, desperate fear of a man who understood that his money and influence could not save him now. For the first time, the wheels of true, impartial justice began to turn. For Alara, watching the wagon carry away the man who had murdered her husband and terrorized her life, it was as if a great, suffocating weight was being lifted from her soul. The cloud of shame that had unjustly hung over the Vance name for so long finally, blessedly, began to lift. With the threat of violence removed, the task of rebuilding began. Their first job was the most painful, clearing the wreckage of the barn. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, hauling away the charred, blackened timbers. The labor was physically punishing, their bodies aching and their hands covered in soot. But with every piece of the ruin they cleared, it felt as though they were also cleansing the violence from their land. It was a slow, emotionally cathartic process, a way of burying the memory of the fire and the siege, of reclaiming their home from the ashes. News, in that part of the country, traveled on the wind, and the story of Silas Croft's arrest for the murder of Thomas Vance was a gale force. It swept through Clayton, overturning long-held certainties and replacing them with a creeping, collective shame. The narrative of the drunken, disgraceful farmer and his pitiable widow was replaced by the truth, the story of a brave man who had been murdered for his integrity, and of a woman who had endured slander and isolation with quiet dignity. The community's attitude underwent a sea change. The walls of social prejudice that had imprisoned Alara did not so much fall as crumble under the weight of the town's own guilt. A few days into their work on the barn, a wagon rumbled up the track. It was Arthur Pearson's, Their old neighbor from the next ranch over, a man who had previously avoided Alara's gaze in town. He was a stooped, sun-weathered man of 60, and his face was etched with a deep and genuine remorse. "Mrs. Vance," he said, removing his hat and crushing the brim in his hands. We heard what happened, what Croft did. I am ashamed to say I believed the stories. I should have known better. Thomas was a good man." He gestured to the back of his wagon, which was loaded with fresh-cut lumber. "It is not much, but I thought you could use it. I would be honored to help you raise a new frame, if you will let me." Alara, stunned by the offer, could only nod, her throat thick with an emotion she could not name. Arthur was the first of many. Over the next few weeks, several townsfolk rode out to the ranch, not with suspicion, but with quiet, heartfelt offers of help. Men came to help lay the foundation for a new, smaller barn. The blacksmith arrived with a box of newly forged hinges and nails, refusing any payment. Even the preacher's wife, Mrs. Miller, made the journey, arriving one afternoon with a basket containing a fresh loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, and a quiet, tearful apology for her husband's sanctimonious judgment and her own coldness. The tentative bridges of community were being rebuilt, one humble gesture at a time. With the help of their new allies, they rounded up their remaining cattle from the far pastures for the market. The work was done in a single day, a communal effort that would have taken the two of them weeks. The cattle sale in the next town over was a resounding success. The price was high, and they returned to the ranch with a heavy metal lockbox that felt as weighty as their future itself. Inside was a small fortune in gold and paper money, more than enough to pay Jedediah his long-overdue $200, with plenty left over to buy seed and supplies for the spring and secure the ranch through the hard months of the coming winter. That evening, the atmosphere inside the small cabin was heavy with unspoken questions. They sat at the rough-hewn table, the lockbox sitting between them like a silent arbiter of their fates. The external conflicts that had forged their bond, the fight for survival, the threat of Croft, the struggle against the land, were now resolved. The ranch was safe. The community was returning. Their future was secure. All that remained was the question of them. The original contract, the debt that had first brought a hardened, solitary cowboy to this dilapidated ranch, hung in the air between them. Alara was gripped by a quiet, piercing fear. For months, their shared struggle had been the very reason for his presence. Now that the struggle was over, was the reason gone too? He had come for a payment, and now the payment was here, sitting in a metal box on the table. Now that he had the means to leave, to finally buy that piece of land in Montana and outrun his ghosts. Would he? Was his protection, his help, his gentleness, his love, just part of seeing a difficult job through to its final conclusion? She watched him, her heart aching with the terrible possibility that she had only won this battle to lose him in the end. Jedediah, too, was quiet, his gaze falling on the lockbox. For 10 years, the idea of gold, of tangible wealth, had been his shield. The $200 he was owed represented the solitary life he had once craved, a life of safety through isolation, a life where he could never again lose what he loved. But as he looked up from the cold, hard box and across the table at Alara, at her strong, beautiful face illuminated by the soft lamplight, he knew with an absolute, soul-deep certainty that his definition of safety had changed. Solitude was no longer a fortress. It was a barren, lonely prison. Home was not a place a man ran to by himself. It was a person he chose to stand with, to fight for, to build with. After a nearly silent meal, the tension stretched to a breaking point. Alara could bear it no longer. With a resolve that cost her dearly, she rose from her chair and walked to the lockbox. She opened it with a small click. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached inside and began to count out the gleaming gold coins. 10 $20 double eagles. She stacked them neatly on the rough wooden table directly in front of Jedediah. The polished metal caught the lamplight, shining with a cold, impersonal fire. She could not bring herself to look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the payment, on the physical manifestation of their original agreement. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a fragile whisper, laden with a universe of love, gratitude, and the heartbreaking fear of his departure. "You came for payment," she began, her voice catching in her throat. Her hand, shaking now, pushed the neat stack of gold an inch closer to him. "Here it is. It is more than earned." Jedediah looked down at the gold. For a decade, this was the goal, his grail, the tangible symbol of a final escape from his past. It represented everything he had once thought he wanted. It was the price of being alone and safe. He stared at the coins, at their perfect, cold weight, and felt nothing but emptiness. He then lifted his gaze from the inanimate metal to Alara's face. He saw her trying so hard to be brave, to honor their contract even if it broke her own heart. He saw the strength that had carried her through widowhood and isolation. He saw the courage that had faced down scandal and ruin. And he saw, in the depths of her beautiful, terrified eyes, an unwavering love that had healed a part of him he had thought was dead forever. In her face, he saw not a future of lonely independence, but one of shared sunrises and quiet companionship. He saw a life. He saw a home. Slowly, with a deliberateness that made Alara's heart stop in her chest, he reached across the table, his large, calloused hand, the same hand that had fought for her and tended her wounds, moved past the gleaming stack of gold coins. He did not touch them. He gently, tenderly, took her hand in his. Her hand was trembling, and he enfolded it in both of his touch both a promise and a prayer. He finally met her gaze, and she saw that the profound, haunted sadness that had lived in his eyes for so long was gone. In its place was a deep and steady calm, a peace she had never seen there before. "The debt is paid, Alara," he said, his voice soft but firm, a bedrock of certainty in the quiet room. "But I am not going anywhere." He squeezed her hand gently. "This is my home now, if you will have me." Tears of overwhelming relief and pure, unadulterated joy began to stream down Alara's face. She could not speak. The words were trapped in her throat by a happiness so immense it was painful. She could only nod, her fingers tightening around his, holding on to him as if he were the only anchor in the world. The gold sat on the table between them, completely forgotten, its power nullified, its cold light utterly vanquished by the warmth of their clasped hands. It was no longer the most valuable thing in the room. In choosing each other, they had both found a payment far greater, far more precious, than the one he had ridden so far to claim. The story closes a season later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks. The new barn stood on the ashes of the old, smaller but sturdier, its fresh-cut pine a testament to their resilience and the kindness of their neighbors. The unforgiving western landscape remained, and the hardships of life would surely continue. But it was no longer a landscape of loneliness. It was a landscape of home. The final image is of Jedediah and Alara standing on their porch at sunset, watching the sky blaze with brilliant streaks of orange and purple. He puts his arm around her shoulders, and she leans her head against his chest, her body fitting against his, as if she were made for that very purpose. They stood in comfortable silence, two broken people made whole by each other, their tragic pasts not erased, but integrated into a future they had chosen to build together. It was a future paid for, not with gold, but with courage, trust, and a love as vast and as durable as the land itself. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are from in the comments so we can all connect. Subscribe to our From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.